Hey class, this is Mr. Clark again, and these are the video lecture notes for Chapter 28, Progressivism and the Republican Roosevelt, 1901 to 1912. Next slide. The first section is entitled Progressive Roots. The roots of the progressive movement were many, including populists and socialists. As the Industrial Revolution and capitalism became more powerful in the United States, there were voices who saw abuses and who sought to reform the system and or change it. And these groups coalesced into the progressive movement. Next slide. Raking muck with the muckrakers. Journalists exposed the ills of industrial capitalism and many societal ills. These so-called muckrakers became quite prominent, and they exposed abuses in industries such as the meat packing industry, the drug industry, oil industry, and their exposés caused politicians to take notice and at some point try to take action to ameliorate some of the seeming abuses in American capitalism. Next slide. Political progressivism. Progressives supported political reforms such as the direct primary, the initiative, the referendum, and women's suffrage. These were attempts to make our country more democratic. For example, the direct primary to elect politicians to office rather than politicians being chosen by state legislatures. And of course, women's suffrage would ultimately come to fruition in the 20th century. All of these reforms, certainly at the state level, took hold. Next slide. Progressivism in the cities and the states. The emergence of the city manager system of government after the Galveston hurricane highlighted municipal reform. The city of Galveston, Texas, received a direct hit from a massive hurricane in 1900, and much of the city was flooded and lay in ruin. In order to rebuild the city, a professional city manager was named, and this form of government, city government, ultimately became the norm, and it was one of the many progressive reforms where a city manager would be a college-educated public administrator who would, in many ways, run the cities of the 20th century rather than the actual elected mayor. Next slide. Progressive women. Women such as Florence Kelley were key figures in the progressive movement. Women played a major role during this period. Florence Kelley was instrumental in fighting labor abuses such as winning reforms like the minimum wage and fighting and supporting plans to end child labor, for example. Next slide. TR's square deal for labor. Roosevelt ended the coal strike of 1902 by threatening to seize mines. As a result, workers won a pay increase. Theodore Roosevelt used his position as president like no other president before him. He personally became involved in issues like the coal strike of 1902, and he became the first president ever to really seek an impartial position, not necessarily supporting business or labor. Before him, it had always been that the government seemingly supported the interests of business. Next slide. TR corrals the corporations. Roosevelt sought to curtail the power of quote-unquote bad trusts like J.P. Morgan's Northern Securities Trust. Theodore Roosevelt got the reputation of being a trust buster. He opposed businesses that had a monopoly or were attempting to monopolize their industry. And the Northern Securities Trust, or Railroad Trust, was a target of Morgan, and it was ultimately broken up. Next slide. Caring for the consumer. Laws such as the Pure Food and Drug Act were popular in the wake of growing public awareness of corporate abuses. There were all kinds of abuses during this period. The meat packing industry, the drug industry, and the legislation that was passed in 1906 was landmark. It was the first real regulatory legislation where food and drugs had to go through inspections, and that has become the norm in our day, and it started back during the Progressive era. Next slide. Earth control. TR supported managed conservation of natural resources. He was opposed by preservationists such as John Muir. The environmental movement really got its start during the Progressive era. Theodore Roosevelt was known as an environmentalist, but probably today he would not be considered so much of one. He was in favor of managing and using natural resources, conserving yet using, whereas people like John Muir wanted to preserve natural resources, like, for example, Yosemite, where they're standing. Here's Roosevelt standing next to John Muir in Yosemite, and you can see Yosemite in the background. Next slide. The Rough Riders' second term. Even though TR continued his progressive policies, he was weakened by a pledge not to run. And Theodore Roosevelt stuck by that pledge. He probably could have won re-election in 1908, but he chose not to run. Next slide. Taft, a round peg in a square hole. Following TR was a tough act to follow for the portly Taft. William Howard Taft had been Governor General of the Philippines, and he was Vice President under Theodore Roosevelt. And as Roosevelt's successor, he had a tough act to follow. Next slide. The dollar goes abroad as a diplomat. Taft tried to increase America's influence in China and the Caribbean through quote-unquote dollar diplomacy. American interests grew overseas during this time. American banks loaned millions of dollars to governments all over Latin America, and in that way the United States began to have more and more influence in other countries than it ever had before. Next slide. Taft, the trust buster. TR's handpicked successor was in many ways more progressive than his predecessor, going after trusts in many ways more fervently than his mentor TR did. Next slide. Taft splits the Republican Party. Taft angered TR and other progressives by firing forestry officials Gifford Pinchot. Pinchot was a supporter of Roosevelt's ideas about conservation, and when he was fired, this created a rift between the two former allies, and this kind of foreshadowed TR's getting back into the political arena. Next slide. The Taft-Roosevelt rupture. TR broke with tradition and sought the Republican nomination over Taft, but failed to win the party convention in 1912. Next slide. And that's it for Chapter 28. We'll come back to Roosevelt and Taft in an upcoming chapter. Talk to you later.